Hello, everyone, and welcome to Envoices, Envoy Magazine's official podcast. My name is Stephanie Fillion, and I'm Envoy Magazine editor-in-chief. And today we are talking about Envoy's special issue on the UN Secretary General race. And joining me today is Dawn Clancy, an Envoy contributor, who's had the very difficult task of following this interactive dialogue of the UN General Assembly. So Dawn, you've been covering basically what is not the most exciting part of the UN, which is very long meeting that sometimes feels scripted. So we can call you our special envoy for the UN Secretary General race. How has it been so far for you following this race?
Well, I agree with you. It can be difficult at times because, for example, the interactive dialogues, they're very long. And then just recently, there was the UN town hall, which honestly was a little bit more interesting in the fact that it was all of the candidates to date. And it was very fancy with Bloomberg kind of partnering with the UNGA, creating these kind of slick video. It reminds me very much of a US presidential televised debate. So that kind of made it a bit more interesting. But yes, it can be quite dull at times. But I think that it requires a little bit closer listening if you're going to get anything out of it, because these candidates, as they're doing these interactive dialogues or this town hall, they're not only speaking to the audience, to the member states, but they're also trying to be quite careful about the way they answer certain questions so as not to alienate. I could use a harsher word, but let's just stay with alienate any of the P5 members who ultimately make the decision of who's going to be the next Secretary General.
Right, because I think you said something very important, which is the look of it looked like an American television debate. But the nature of this election process is completely different than a national election, because ultimately the audience they're speaking to, it's not voters, it's really the 193 member states. So, how does that influence you think the way they approach it?
Well, one of the sources that I spoke to for the article in the magazine, she called it theater, which I thought was a really good way to describe it, because just like you said, they're not speaking necessarily to the voters, although I'm sure members of the P5 are listening. When I initially watched the interactive dialogues, I was kind of annoyed. I was like, this is a useless waste of time. They're not saying anything. But then as I reported the story out more, I realized that they are under a lot of pressure because the real discussions, the ones that matter, happen behind closed doors with the members of the P5. For example, during his interactive dialogue, Raphael Grossi, who's the head of the IAEA, I really felt like he's a perfect example of someone who showed up to tick a box. They are all aware that it's the P5 that'll make this ultimate decision. And of course, there's 15 members of the Security Council. When they finally do get down to the voting, 9 of them have to vote in favor of a candidate with no vetoes from the permanent 5. So that's a hard task. But they're all aware of that. But he really gave the impression, at least the impression that I got, is that he was there to take a box. He had dinner in a half hour and he needed to get out of there. But they are under a lot of pressure because, like you said, the people in front of them aren't the ones who are going to be the deciding factor.
Right. And just for our listeners who may not like us be following the UN every day. So the P5, they're the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are the United States, China, the UK, France, and Russia. And they really hold an unusual amount of power over the decision making because ultimately they have a veto. Now, Dawn, let's go back to the month of April. So when you started reporting this story, the field of candidate was very different. It was a little bit less crowded. And even when we look back at the process in 2016, when there were 13 candidates, it's still a pretty small field of candidates. But let's go back to the first interactive dialogue that you watched. So tell us about this one. So there were 4 candidates at the time. How was it? And who do you think stood out in that field of candidate?
In the beginning months when we had that first set of interactive dialogues over 2 days, 2 candidates each day for 3 hours each, just again, going back to that issue of being quite difficult to watch or to listen to because it's a lot of information. I have to say the first thing that stood out to me then was of the four candidates, which was Raphael Grossi, Rebecca Grynspan, Macky Sall, and Michelle Bachelet, none of those candidates really stood out to me as bringing anything exciting to the table. And that's some of the feedback that I heard from some of the sources that I leaned on for the story for the magazine, is that that seemed to be the one element that was missing after you finish watching 6, 9, 12 hours of interactive dialogue. You walk away kind of like, would I remember any of these candidates necessarily? I can't really say that there was one that stood out to me that did the best job. They just kind of did their own thing. Macky Sall seemed quite disorganized, but when I went back and watched the interactive dialogues for a second time, which I did, I was punishing myself, I realized that when member states were asking questions, they weren't just asking one or two, they were asking 5 or 6 questions in a row. And the candidates only had maybe 2 or 3 minutes to answer. So I can see how that would be a bit overwhelming. Like, Norway just asked you, and I'm just picking Norway randomly, 6 questions, and then you've got 2 minutes, and you're like, okay, where do I start? So I think that really set him off a little bit. Michelle Bachelet, in my opinion, she seemed a bit of the most nervous of the candidates, but she was also the firmest in her principles. When she said, when she answered a question about member states not paying their dues on time, and when she said, oh, I'll have a conversation with them about that, she didn't say those exact words, I believed her. Raphael Grossi, again, going back to Mr. Grossi, I really felt like he was there ticking a box. What was really interesting about him is that he didn't step down. Once he announced his candidacy, he didn't step down from the IAEA. He's the head, it's not required, but it's recommended. Rebecca Grynspan, who was also running at the time, which she's still running, she did. She's the head of UNCTAD, and she stepped down. So that's kind of something interesting to keep in mind there, because the U.S. is at war with Iran, and there's still the war going on with Ukraine and Russia. So as the head of the IAEA, when there's so much nuclear power involved, he gets to stay in front of the permanent 5 on a regular basis to discuss these issues, especially recently with Iran. So maybe that was a bit strategic. Maybe I'm thinking too hard about it. I don't know. Rebecca Grynspan, she was definitely the most energetic. And she's always energetic. She's always using her hands. I think in the latest town hall, she kept hitting the microphone because she was using her hands so much, which I thought was interesting. But that's really what I walked away with. Again, really hard for the candidates, I think, to walk that line where they are being transparent, they're showing their face, but then also really being careful about what they say so that they don't alienate the P5.
Right. And I think one thing you mentioned, I would agree with, because it is very interesting with Raphael Grossi, because even as journalists, it does create these very ambiguous situations where sometimes you will be giving press conferences as the Director General of the IAEA, but he would also take questions as a candidate for Secretary General. So he does kind of wear those 2 hats at the same time. But, there is no specific rules on that. Well, it's recommended, as you're saying. So as of now, it's a situation that's been pretty much accepted. So when we look maybe like candidate by candidate, so let's start with them, I think Grossi, because when he began his campaign, I think very quickly people crowned him as the future, as the next Secretary General. People said, the U.S. love him, and other countries also seem to appreciate him a lot. So what is your understanding? There is this performance where you say he came to kind of take a box. But overall, when you're looking at the field of candidates at the campaign, did you get a sense that he also is still leading the race, or do you feel like it's not a done deal yet?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I completely agree with you. At the beginning, at that time, Grossi was seen as the winner, crowned the winner in a lot of people's eyes. And he does have that position of being the head of the IAEA, has the exposure to the P5. In fact, just recently this week, there was a U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee meeting where U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz was being asked questions about UN reform. And in that meeting, he actually said, we are on a regular contact basis with Raphael Grossi. So who knows? I think now, after watching the town hall, which was just yesterday, there was an informal poll that was held after the, I think it was like almost a 2-hour debate. And they had an informal poll about, who do you think can bring the UN forward as Secretary General? And he scored very low on that. I think it was something like 8% of the people who voted. And I have no idea how many people voted in that. I don't have that information. But he scored the lowest at 8%. Then I think it was Macky Sall at 9%. Carolyn Rodrigues-Birkett, she got nearly half of the vote. But again, I don't know how many people were voting in that. So that's interesting. I don't know. He is the head of the IAEA. He's a very technical person. He clearly goes in, can walk into rough situations and get things done. But all of those conversations happen behind closed doors. So again, it comes back to transparency. Does it really matter that he only scored 8% of an informal poll at the end of a town hall? I don't know. Does it matter? I don't know.
And now Michelle Bachelet, I think she's a very interesting candidate because when you look at her resume, I think her resume is the one that maybe reflects Antonio Guterres's the most. She was a head of state. She was the first woman president of Chile. And then she also had a very high level UN agency. That being said, she's been an underdog ever since she announced her candidacy. And part of it is related to the report on human rights in China that she released, which made, I think, both the US and China very unhappy, almost equally. So you did say that she held very strong opinions when she was in the town hall. So do you think that she even has a chance? How are you perceiving her as a candidate?
Well, I think for the reasons that you mentioned, especially because she was the first head of UN Women, and she has angered the US, and they've publicly responded to that. They've publicly shared their dissatisfaction with Michelle Bachelet and China as well. I don't really think that she's in the running as far as that view from the P5. And a lot of that has to do with the Trump administration, and from the very start, especially of his second administration, there's been this really hard push against anything DEI related. So unfortunately, I think she represents that to the United States, but I think that is just going to be held against her. Like you said, she does. She has so much experience in the UN system, but she's made several P5 members angry doing her job. I don't think that puts her in the running. I don't think she's at the front of that pack.
Which is very interesting because what we're discussing says nothing about her qualification for the job, right? But that's just the very nature of this selection process, which is so political.
Yeah. And I will say, watching this town hall that happened yesterday, I walked away thinking to myself, the Secretary General, everybody talks about, and even Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, has said this: I have the least amount of power, I have the least amount of money, but yet this race is like so heavy, and it's so political and it's so important. It's like this position has no power. It's kind of interesting contrast.
Yeah. Now maybe turning to Rebeca Grynspan. I think she's also a very interesting candidate. When I talk to people who are working with her at the UN, people get very enthusiastic about her. I think she does have this energy. She seems like she's a real dynamo. And people seem to be very optimistic about her, but I always kind of wonder what kind of pull that she has with the powerful permanent five of the Security Council. So how did that translate in the interactive dialogue?
I agree with you completely. She's definitely the most energetic candidate in her presentation. I think during her interactive dialogue, she made some comment handed comment about how she has two sisters and they're always discussing things. So she will never get tired of talking. And as Secretary General, you do a lot of that. I guess as a diplomat in general, you do a lot of that. But as the world's top diplomat, that's top of your agenda. She was instrumental in negotiating the Black Sea Grain Initiative between Russia and Ukraine. And that's important. So clearly she can get the job done. That deal hasn't necessarily held, but I don't think that's necessarily because of anything that she or the Secretary General did. It's just an outcome of a war, of a conflict. But I would say that to me, she is the wild card. She's a wild card to me because I don't see her as appealing necessarily to certain P5 members because she does have that energy about her. But then again, maybe she does. I don't know. And you and I have discussed before that, outside of that world, she gets a lot of positive feedback and people say that they work with her. But I would consider her a wild card. I have no idea. All I know is that she's incredibly energetic and she can get the job done. She's the wild card.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Antonio Guterres, is one of the main criticism about him that we hear, at least a recurring criticism, is the fact that, he likes to work in the shadow, that is very quiet as a Secretary General. So if people want energetic, I think Rebeca Grynspan kind of embodies that change in at least the way that she presents herself as a leader, as a potential Secretary General. But once again, I'm not sure how much the P5 take into account when selecting how much energy they take as a criteria to choose the next Secretary General. And so now Macky Sall, who is definitely a candidate who came a bit out of the left field. Nobody really expected him to run, and he didn't even get the support of the African Union as a candidate. So we do have to mention that there is an sort of informal geographic rotation that has been sporadically respected when it comes to the selection of Secretary General. So the last cycle, it was supposed to be Latin America. Guterres, who's from Portugal, ended up becoming Secretary General. So this time it does seem even more important that a candidate comes from Latin America. So Macky Sall definitely does not check that box. It's quite unclear why he decided to run and how his candidacy is perceived inside the UN. Dawn, can you give us a sense of how you perceive his candidacy after following, how he's behaved over the past few months as a candidate?
Sure. From the moment that I reported on this story, the people that I interviewed for the story, they all said the same thing about Macky Sall. He's not a serious candidate and nobody's taking him seriously. After watching him through the interactive dialogue and then through the town hall, I kind of felt the same way. Like, where did he come from? He just kind of popped out of nowhere. And I do agree with you that the idea of regional rotation with the Secretary General seems to be a lot more important this election. I don't mean to say important as compared to others, but there seems to be a lot of emphasis on honoring that. So that kind of knocks Macky Sall out of the running. I just don't get the sense that he's a serious consideration among the P5. Although I will say that at the town hall, he did say something really interesting that I feel like created a really great visual, but it probably will not help him in the election at all, where he compared himself to an organist. Like, if you imagine an organ in a church, it's huge. It has all these pipes coming out of it. And he was talking about how you have to be really skilled as the organist to bring all those sounds together to make it sound good. So I could be the organist for the UN, for the member states. And I thought that was just a really clever visual that he painted. But again, I don't think the P5 are sitting around like amazed perhaps as I am that he created that visual. So unfortunately, I don't think he's serious candidate.
It is, quite an interesting metaphor for the organization. So something maybe to keep in mind for future Secretary Generals. And so now when you were reporting on the piece following the interactive dialogue, María Fernanda Espinosa from Ecuador, she's a former president of the General Assembly, she launched her campaign. So to me personally, it wasn't a big surprise because she has been so active in the world of international organization for the past few years. She's been very involved in the campaign to elect a female secretary. So to me, it always kind of felt that she was getting ready to run, but you never really know. And I'm sure that she's probably been feeling the field until the very last minute until she decided to launch her campaign. So you got an exclusive interview with her. Can you tell us a little bit about what she told you? You had her own interactive dialogue after she launched her candidacy. So how do you think she fares among the other candidates? And, what stood out from your own conversation with her?
Well, actually, you were the one, I believe, at one point we were texting around the time that the first 4 candidates had been out in the open. They had completed their interactive dialogues, and you had actually said, the rumor is that she's going to throw her hat in the ring, and then she did. So you called it. I did get to speak to her separately. The other candidates, of course, I just reported on their experience in the interactive dialogues. And when I spoke with her, it was still very early in her campaign. So I did get the sense that there was still some organizing to be done and actually I said campaign, and I said that during my interview with her, and I got corrected, not by her, but by someone who was, I don't remember his name, but he was kind of organizing the phone calls and all of this. And he says, it's not a campaign. And as far as I know, that they don't like it when you call it a campaign, because who are they campaigning? But they kind of are a campaign. But anyway, I felt like it was so early in her candidacy that in her answers, they weren't necessarily the most organized. I had to really slow down and pay attention to the things that she was saying. She's been the only candidate so far, and I have no evidence of this. I'm not trying to say that I've studied this and I have a case, but she seems to be the candidate that has repeated publicly some of the things that some P5 members have mentioned in the off times that they may say something about the election and what they're looking for. So, for example, Russia has repeated that they're all about sovereignty. We don't want a Secretary General or a UN that's going to mess with our sovereignty and try to impose things on us. And in my interview with Fernanda Espinosa, she made sure to emphasize that. Then what's also interesting is that, again, going back to that House Foreign Affairs Committee meeting that just happened this past week, I believe it was the day before the town hall, U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz had mentioned something about climate, and this is also something that the U.S. has pushed back heavily on. Something about climate, the way that the UN approaches climate, and how we don't need to have, 10 or 15 different offices dealing with climate. That's not exactly what he said, but I'm paraphrasing. And then in the town hall, when she was asked about climate, Fernanda Espinosa made that her first point. We don't need to have all of these people dealing with climate. I kind of track that with her. Again, I'm not saying that it's intentional. I have no proof, but it's just something that has stuck in my ear since I spoke with her. Most interesting too about her that I didn't know is that she's actually quite an accomplished author. She's an accomplished poet. She's published. And I just thought that was really interesting because I'm thinking, to be an author, to be a poet seems like a more relaxed and calm state of being than being the Secretary General of the United Nations, if she's given the role. So that kind of stood out to me. And during that interview, I did make it a point to ask her about that. And, it's kind of interesting because we did it over Zoom, so I could see her face light up immediately when we started talking about different poets and stuff. So that was interesting. I asked her to write a poem about me. I don't know why. I don't know why. I was just joking around with her. I mean, she hasn't done so, but I did ask her, if you win, are you going to write a poem about that? And she said maybe she would, maybe she won't. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
We have a lot of art coming into this race between the organ and the...
Exactly. Okay. There you go.
Well, that definitely lightens things up, especially when we're talking about wars and Iran and Ukraine. Definitely nice to talk about art from time to time.
Yes.
And so now one other candidate came forward since your piece got published. So can you tell us a little bit about her? And I think she was very successful in the latest round of interactive dialogue, right?
Yes, she was. Again, going back to that informal poll that they had after the town hall, she scored nearly 50% favorable vote of coming from the question, who do you think will best lead the UN going forward? That's not the exact question, but that's the heart of the question she had. Large portion. Again, I don't know how many people voted, how many people voted in that. It could have been 2 people. It could have been 200. I don't know. But she's really interesting, Carolyn Rodrigues-Birkett, because she was the permanent representative for Guyana, and she served on the Security Council for 2 years as a non-permanent member. And in my opinion, she was the most outspoken. She had such a strong moral compass when it came to speaking out and being direct about the war in Gaza, calling out Israel, about different situations with the war in Ukraine and Russia, being a permanent member of the Security Council and conducting a war. She also, staying on the art note, when she sat on the Security Council, she did quote Bob Marley. Bob Marley has a song called War, and she did quote him. So again, we're going on that art, which always stuck in my ear with her. I didn't get to interview her for the story. Like you said, she announced her candidacy at a later date. But I think at the town hall, she really held her own. She seemed to come off as being the most serious in her answers. The way that she delivered them, she came across as being just very sturdy in that. And it showed because that informal poll, whether she's a serious candidate among the P5, I don't really know, because like I said, when she was in the Security Council, she was very critical of Israel. And I can imagine that for a country like the United States, that could be a major sticking point. But as a Secretary General, her job is to be that voice. I think she could pull it off. But again, the politics going on behind the scenes with the P5, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what discussions they're having, but that's just something that I thought of when I was listening to her. She sounds so great and she sounds so polished and ready to go, but there are these political considerations that may get in the way for her.
Right. But I think one thing that she has going for her that other candidates don't is that she was on the Security Council every day, not that long ago. And I think none of the other candidates has that kind of experience where she really was able to build relationships with ambassadors on the Security Council. So it's hard to say how much that's going to impact decisions in terms of voting, because we know that these decisions are made in capitals, but ambassadors very often, they do have unique access to foreign ministers. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out for her, because diplomats did seem quite enthusiastic about.
Right. And she was one of the few people on the Security Council that whenever Guyana was up to deliver their remarks, it kind of sat up straighter, because you're like, okay, what's she going to say? That excitement perhaps could be blending over into the P5. We just don't know. We don't know.
Yeah. And I remember at the time, one thing that really stood out for Guyana is that they had an all-women team. And that's something that I've never seen in the UN system, and especially for countries that are on the Security Council.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The way that they film them when they deliver their remarks, it's like, here's the permanent representative or the ambassador looking in front of the camera, and then they've got their posse behind them. So it was kind of like interesting, like you said, wow, like she's got all women behind her, that stood out. Yes, absolutely.
And now, I guess the last thing that we should be talking about are the candidates that are not candidates yet, because there are still 6 are not, it's not a lot of candidates, and there are still rumors going around that there will be more. And one rumor that's been going around for a long time is the Deputy Secretary General, Hamina Mohammed, who people say she's from Nigeria, and people say that she may run, but and that's very possible. And I don't know if you have any sense that if she is popular, if she has any chance. Have you heard anything from the people you spoke to, or has that not come up yet in your discussions?
That hasn't come up, but interestingly, she gave a press conference at the UN in New York about this report that came out regarding progress towards the SDGs. And there was a reporter in the room who did ask her directly, are you going to be running? And she said no, because she's really focused on the SDGs and the job that she's doing now. I mean, does that mean that that could change? Of course it could change. You know, it's like a soap opera. But she did address that, and she did kind of take that off the table, but who knows? Things change.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure at least one of the candidates running right now answered no when they were asked if they were
Yeah,
going to run. So I
exactly.
think there's always a little bit of room to change their mind.
Yes, exactly.
And now the most surprising possible candidate that also came out from the far left field this week was Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA.
Yes. Yeah, the media is reporting that Trump is playing with the idea of nominating Gianni Infantino. He's the head of FIFA. The World Cup was held this year across 3 countries, Mexico, Canada, and the US, but the majority of the games were played in the US. And Infantino, you know, seems to really be on Trump's good side. He awarded Trump the first ever FIFA Peace Prize around the same time that President Trump was really annoyed that he hadn't been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. It would be on brand for the Trump administration and for Trump specifically, but there are 4 other members on the Security Council, which we've mentioned, that have a veto. So the U.S. can't impose themselves on the final vote that way, because there are other countries that have that veto as well. But it's definitely interesting. I think it goes to show just how far some flattery can get you with President Trump. You know, one minute you're the head of FIFA, and the next minute, I don't know, maybe he's going to be nominated to be his next vice president if J.D. Vance steps down for some reason. I don't know. But we'll have to see. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting news.
It does add to this soap opera aspect of it, which in this case, because we're talking about Latin America, I guess we could aptly call it maybe a telenovela even.
Wait. Exactly. I mean, yes, that is quite dramatic. Yes, telling about, yes, I'm laughing because I'm picturing some of the episodes that I've watched, and it's very dramatic. Oh man. But yeah, that's a good point. We're still on the arts kind of vein here. You know, we'll see what happens. We'll see.
Right. No, that would make for a good telenovela when we think about all the dramas, and I'm sure there will be more drama, because I was in an off-the-record briefing this week about the straw poll and the process, and the question of what happens if they don't agree on a single candidate by December came up. So it does sound like it is an option that people are exploring, because there's no set date in terms of like when the Security Council, you know, they have to agree by December, but people, you know, we're talking about an extremely polarized Security Council in the United Nations in general. So it does sound like it is a possibility so far that they just can't agree on a single candidate.
Exactly. And there's a feeling there that could happen. And you know, at this point, anyone can come forward as a candidate, or anyone could be pulled forward as a candidate, as we saw with, you know, President Trump, just what we were just discussing. So there's still plenty of time. I mean, August, September, October, November, we could say 5 months, but 5 months, you know, will go by in a flash. There could even be candidates that the P5 decides upon that we don't ever hear about until they're nominated, until maybe they become the next Secretary General. So again, that goes back to this this idea of transparency and having these interactive dialogues and these town halls where the candidates really don't say much of anything, but it goes back again to that need for the transparency. Who are these candidates? Who are you talking about? What's going on in these discussions? We don't know.
Right. And it can be a strategy in itself, which is to wait until the very, very, very last minute to become a candidate, because because it could be the way in. We just don't know, because it's such an unusual process. And we always think about elections as elections and voters and about specific dates. But because there is no specific deadline, we can really see other candidates arise in October, November, even December. Who knows?
Right, exactly. So everybody needs to just pay attention, keep paying attention.
Right. Yes, because it's exciting for us and we're trying to make it
Yes.
exciting for other people.
Exactly. And that's one of the problems the candidates were asked questions about, is the UN relevant? Well, I guess we're going to find out, people are paying attention. Maybe Trump with this recent thinking of Gianni Infantino, maybe that will get more people interested.
Exactly. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground. So Dawn Clancy, freelance reporter and Envoy's contributor and honorary Secretary General race specialist. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for following the race that closely for us.
Yes, of course. Thank you.